Good evening. Welcome to Harvard University, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Tim Harjo, and I am a second-year Master's in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School of Government. It's my honor to introduce our first forum event of 2007, and thank you. I'd like to introduce you tonight to our moderator, Professor Joe Kalt. Professor Kalt is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy. He also serves as the co-director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. Harvard Project has, for the last 20 years, worked with and for Indian tribes in this country on issues facing nation building. With that, Professor Kalt.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to have our leaders here tonight. As some of you know, and we hope many of you will learn, Indian America is a story of resilience, and we're in the midst of a tremendous resurgence of tribes, economically, politically, culturally. American Indian tribes in the United States, for example, are growing 3 times faster than the U.S. economy. That's true of both the tribes that have gambling casinos and those that don't. What's going on? What's going on, we think, the research says, is that policies of self-determination and self-governance, tribes running their own programs, running everything from police departments to schools, to housing programs, to rewriting their constitutions. These policies of self-determination are putting Native people in positions of authority and accountability. And that's dramatically improving many of America's Indian nations. And tonight, we're thrilled to have with us leaders in that movement, leaders in the movement for self-determination and self-governance. To my left immediately is Chairman Ron Allen. For 3 decades has served as chairman of the Jamestown S'Klallam tribe of Western Washington. Has also served as the president of NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, the primary Washington, D.C. based organization of tribes, served also as vice president of NCAI, and is currently treasurer of NCAI. And needless to say, with 30 years of chairmanship of his own nation, Ron is a widely recognized leader in Indian country. Next, President Mark Chino of the Mescalero Apache tribe. Became president of Mescalero Apache in January of 2004. Also serves as chairperson of the management board of the Mescalero Apache tribe's well-known Inn of the Mountain Gods. Mark also, prior to becoming president of Mescalero Apache, for 30 years had a career in law enforcement as a police officer and a criminal investigator. Next, and I'm quite proud of this case because she's a student of mine, the Honorable Chairwoman-elect of the Fond du Lac, Lake Superior, Chippewa, Karen Diver. Karen is a 2003 graduate of the Kennedy School's mid-career Master's in Public Administration, and was elected last Tuesday and will be sworn into office Wednesday. Karen is the first woman to serve as the chief executive of her nation. And prior to becoming the chairwoman-elect of Fond du Lac, she served in many areas of social services, including 11 years as the executive director of the YWCA of Duluth, Minnesota. Next, Diane Inus. Diane is president of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community outside of Phoenix, Arizona. Prior to her becoming president at Salt River, Diane had a long career as an attorney, a criminal attorney in the state of Arizona. Last on the far end, Joe Garcia. Joe Garcia has served a number of times as the governor of the Oque-Owingeh Pueblo, formerly San Juan Pueblo in New Mexico. Joe is the current president of the National Congress of American Indians. He's been, I guess, second lieutenant governor, and I'm sure many other positions with his own pueblo. He's worked for more than 25 years as an engineer at Los Alamos National Laboratory and teaches and is taught at Northern New Mexico Community College. So with that, I'd like to turn to our questions and welcome to all of you. And tonight's topic focuses on the trust responsibility. For our audience, some of you may not know, federal legal policy and Indian policy is structured around an historic trust relationship founded in various laws, court rulings, treaties, and so forth. But with so many tribes now taking over and running their own programs, with federal funding so weak, with treaties going unfulfilled, let me put the question to you, what is the trust responsibility in fact now? Is there anything left of it? So many tribes pushing so hard to govern their own affairs. Ron, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, the trust responsibilities is changing, and it's not changing in its legal context. There are legal obligations that the federal government has to the tribes and our peoples with regard to the management of the lands and the resources that we have available and the revenue that's generated from those resources. So the federal government has taken on that responsibility and it still retains it, and the tribes will never relinquish the federal government's responsibility from it. We're in the middle of a law case right now trying to resolve an issue of mismanagement, but when it addresses the government-to-government relationship and the ability of the tribes to be able to administer what was normally federal functions to assist the tribes, functions that were promises made in treaties or statutes or other kinds of commitments, executive orders, that sort of thing, to the Indian tribes and our peoples. Now the tribes in the last 15 years particularly have evolved to the point where we want to administer those programs and manage them ourselves as governments. And so that is changing. We're taking control over those resources, as limited as they are. There is not enough resources to really address all the issues, from healthcare to housing, natural resources, and so forth. But we are finding that if we administer them ourselves, we can administer them in a way that's more consistent with our cultural values, the things that are of importance to our communities, better than the federal government.
Mark, any thoughts on where the trust relationship is?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Indian people, that various Indian tribes throughout this country are the only minority groups that are specifically recognized as having a relationship with the federal government. And I don't think that to that extent it's ever going to go away. And as Ron mentioned, I think the role of the federal government has changed over the last few years and maybe even more than that to making sure that the tribes that do want to run their own programs stay within the various federal parameters that are set and use the federal funds as those federal funds were intended. So it's become more of an oversight responsibility as opposed to being paternalistic and telling the tribes, you spend your money in this manner and no other.
And I take it Mescalero has been aggressive in this way?
Mescalero has been very aggressive. It has a history of being extremely aggressive in making sure that the federal government lives up to its trust responsibility.
But also in making your own decisions. Correct?
Definitely.
Yes. Karen, twist the question a little bit for you. You've just been elected. Was the issue of the trust responsibility and Fond du Lac's response and aggressiveness to that issue, with respect to that issue, an issue in your election?
Very much so. Fond du Lac has always been a leader in Indian country in being self-governance, contractual relationships, new initiatives, new programs, pushing for treatment as a state over air and water quality. Our issue is equity across tribes. We do have gaming, we have other forms of business, so we are able to self-fund to some extent. However, given the federal-Indian trust relationship, I don't expect that we should have to self-fund all of our government operations because basic services were promised under the treaty. Some basic level of healthcare, educational support, that frees up our other monies for other types of infrastructure development, diversifying our economy. So there are plenty of needs still in Indian country, and whether we are wealthy or poor as tribes, the contract in the form of the treaty still remains, and the government doesn't get to get left off the hook just because we've been able to be successful for ourselves. And we would hope that would be so for all of the tribes.
Diane, at Salt River, with your strides in economic development there, it sure looks like more and more your relationships are with the city of Phoenix and with the state of Arizona and city of Scottsdale. What's the nature of your federal trust relationship now with the federal government?
I think in answering the question about where the trust relationship is with tribes in general, we have to go back and look at the United States Constitution and the Commerce Clause. Why was it set up that Congress would deal directly with Indian tribes? And that's, to me, and I think a lot of people, the origins of the trust relationship. And that relationship is still strong today. It doesn't matter how successful tribes are, and it doesn't matter how little the federal government wants to give tribes in the contract sense, so for those services that we all contracted to have from the federal government, especially self-governance. It may look like we're dealing a lot with the cities and the counties and the state, because we have to, as a matter of business. We're dealing with outside interests that want to come in and do businesses with the community. We're dealing with roads. We're dealing with common interests with county, state, and city government. So we do have to deal with them. But we deal with them on a government-to-government basis. And I think that's the current face of the trust relationship.
Now, you've mentioned this, Salt River is a self-governance tribe.
Yes, we are.
And describe what that means.
Basically, it means that where the federal government the BIA used to run programs on reservations, specifically Salt River, like for instance, education, the police department, the police, law enforcement as examples. They would fund it and they would run the programs for us in our community. Self-governance has meant that we've stepped away from that. We've contracted for those services. In essence, what they do is they give us a certain amount of money to cover those services. Obviously, that doesn't cover all the cost of those services, but essentially we run our own programs.
But we also self-governance allows us to negotiate for the federal functions, not just the money identified for our respective tribe, but we can negotiate the federal functions that they administered, and that share goes to the tribe, and it allows us to redesign those programs the way our people want them to be run, not the way they designed them in Washington, D.C.
That's correct. It's all in the negotiation. Well, recently, under the last several years, we've seen the federal government start to make more stringent controls on those contracts. And that can be problematic for tribes, and it's certainly problematic for us, especially those tribes that don't have the resources of some of the larger tribes.
The research certainly indicates that running programs the way each community wants to run them is helping. But Joe, as president of NCAI, you're on the front lines with respect to the federal trust relationship, and I'm sure walk the halls of Congress quite a bit. What's your view on where the trust relationship stands right now? Do you think the federal government is living up to it? What's your view on this?
Well, I think the trust responsibility remains intact through whatever treaties have been signed, and it's important to understand that there are a certain number of treaties, and some of the things that are contained within those treaties could be different from tribe to tribe, from nation to nation, but the overall comprehensive approach, I think, is the thing that we need to look at, and that means that the trust responsibility having to do with taking care of the land, the minerals, the waters. That's underlying, because that's part of the environment and Mother Earth, and if we forget that, then all is gone. But aside from that, we also need to worry about things such as the Pueblos in New Mexico are completely under different. We really don't have any treaties. We're covered under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is a treaty signed between the United States and Mexico. And that document has all of the underlying things that the Pueblos have right now. And one of those is the recognition that sovereignty is a big, big issue. And Spain recognized our sovereignty. And as well, the United States recognizes the sovereignty. And that's the thing that we have in the Pueblo countries. We have two canes representing sovereignty acknowledged by two nations, Spain and the United States of America. And so I think that the trust responsibility still holds. It's just a matter of how it's functional or how the programs operate. And so when we only talk about programs, we kind of diminish the level of responsibility. And that's why we keep saying that there's a diminishing and there's a chipping away at sovereignty, because those programs sort of define that. But if we take it to the next level, it's really the entirety of it, of the sovereign nation that we represent, that needs to be a sovereign to a sovereign. And those issues are not diminished, and those responsibilities that the federal government made itself, those are not diminished, and therefore we keep fighting for that. And so That's the big issue that we continue to fight, but even the fighting arena is no longer fighting. We don't say fighting anymore. It's more of working together to resolve those issues. And so it's a different approach, but
sure.
it's working. So.
If I might add, when you talk about trust, trust comes in a number of different concepts. We're talking about trust in terms of the obligations of the federal government to the Indian nations. Then there's the trust that I referenced earlier, the trust obligations of managed resources on behalf of the tribe or on behalf of the tribal individuals. That's a different kind of a trust. And that kind of a trust are the capacities of tribal governments to administer that trust responsibility. We could take that over. We have the capacity to do that. The trust obligation of the federal government to the Indian nations, whether it's treaty, statute, executive order, or other legal documents where there's a commitment, that trust is a very unique government-to-government trust that has to be sustained and maintained in perpetuity. That's a different level of trust. So a lot of times people get confused between the two.
Let me put a question to you about this. We at the Harvard Project and the Native Nations Institute go out a lot and work with tribal councils and teach executive education and so forth. And I promised some folks in Oklahoma last Thursday and Friday I'd put the following question to you about the trust responsibility. Some concern out there when we talk to tribal councils. They hear what Joe's saying, getting aggressive. It's not just running programs. It's rewriting our constitutions and changing our forms of government, asserting jurisdiction. It's not just administering some old federal programs. And the question comes back, that we get back, if we get too aggressive, if we start really pushing the boundary on jurisdiction, on our own forms of government, and move beyond just administering programs, are we risking the trust relationship? Not in a legal sense, but in a practical sense. Do you think that Indian tribes, as they get more successful, get more aggressive, in fact, the system will pull back on the federal system will pull back on the trust responsibility? There are council members out there who want to hear what you have to say on that.
That's a two-way thing, because the more responsibilities tribes assume willingly, and it goes back to defining what we feel we are wanting to do, how we define ourselves. Responsibility goes along with that. For instance, the tribal courts. A lot of the issues that circulate right now, and have for the last several years, we've lost criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. I don't know that we ever really firmly had it, but that's an aspect of sovereignty that tribes really ought to have. If we were really a sovereign, we would like to have civil and criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, the recognition of our immunity from suit, among other things, our right to tax, and some people would even go so far as to say our right to have a standing military force. And that's kind of a little joke here. But those are aspects of a true sovereign. And the more aggressive I think that tribes come to the table with saying that we are asserting our sovereignty, along with it goes a responsibility. We have to make sure that those courts are up and they're fair, and they're well-staffed, and you have a fair sense of justice.
Backing up
in
those
courts.
assertions with...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it could make it difficult for us.
So we have to be accountable for what we undertake. And I think that if a responsible party is not doing that role, not being responsible, and if we take over, then by our sovereign rights, we should be able to do that. But we better be well prepared to do that. And I think that's been the fear in the past. It's this underlying fear that, oh my gosh, I better not fight the BIA because they're going to cut my funds. And so what's the reality? They're cutting funds anyway.
Yeah.
And so I think that the sovereignty part is the important piece, that you use that to your advantage. And so when we communicate and we work with, say, for instance, the states, sometimes we tend to think, oh my gosh, I'm going to hide behind my sovereignty, so I don't want to give up any information. But rather, let's look at the other side of it and say, by us sharing information and agreeing to share information, whether it be about law enforcement, about jurisdiction, about taxes and other things, if you work with those sovereign entities as a sovereign nation yourself, then that's using your power and your authority so that you can work and come to resolutions on those problems that exist. But if you don't do it that way, then the tables turn. And so I think that piece of it is the advice that we should take ourselves and move it to the ultimate. And as such, the sovereign nation of the United States of America, it's got to hold its obligations. That's just the way it is, and I think we have to be the ones to push that, to say, you obligated to do this, and you have to stand by your obligations. And as we do, when we sign treaties or when we sign agreements, we're obligated to maintain and, of course, to make corrections if there need to be, but I think we don't look at it that way, then we stand to diminish our own power.
Karen, I keep thinking of you having just ended a campaign less than a week ago at your tribe. How does this play? Joe says, we got to push, push, push. As he says, there's not much funding there anyway. Diane says, you got to push it and then back it up with the ability to run your own courts, your own police, and so forth, so that you're standing there as a sovereign. How does this play back home with the people?
Certainly building capable institutions, rule of law, level playing field, accountability, transparency were all key messages for our community. A small rural community, 3,800 members. Tribal government was a mystery to us as well as surrounding jurisdiction. And so understanding for individual community members, they understand that we are sovereigns. They understand, though, that they rely on their own government at home to take care of their needs, not the feds, because politics is personal and we're all family. What worries us, I think, most of all is we've been very aggressive in developing our regulatory functions, our health and human services, so that we can meet our needs better. And we've developed good relationships with surrounding jurisdiction, but there's always the specter over our heads of Congress's plenary power. And we saw that with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. The Native America's got a pretty good gig going there. They're raising their own revenues. The control factor at the federal level was, how successful are we going to let them be before we rein them in? So I think it's a fine line for Indian country, and I think that the National Congress of American Indians is going to be really key in developing a consistent message across Indian country of saying, where should that line be, and is it going to be different for all of the tribal nations across the country? And I think developing those local relationships with surrounding jurisdictions is going to be key because their clout's going to mean more at the federal level, I think, many times than tribal clout will. And so if we can have good relationships, I think we'll get further with our aggressive assertions of sovereignty. And we certainly, I think as everybody knows, whether it's Indian policy or other policy, Congress doesn't always have the best fix. We need to develop that ourselves.
Mark, we were joking a minute ago that Mescalero Apache has a long history of aggressive assertions of sovereignty. I'd like to ask you, how do you see your relationships now with your neighboring jurisdictions, the state of New Mexico in particular? How are things going? Is it starting to work better?
Well, I think when you talk about sovereignty, you have to take into account that each tribe has its own concept of what that relationship with the federal government means to that particular tribe. With Mescalero, as we said, we've always had a long history of being very, very aggressive in making sure that the federal government meets its responsibilities to our people. And I think part of that goes back to our history, because the Apache people, particularly the Chiricahua Apaches, were held as prisoner of war by the United States government for about 27 years. And so these things are not things that are easily forgotten by the generations of Indian people. And a lot of tribes judge the obligation that the United States owes to their people by things that happened in the past. And I think that's certainly the case at Mescalero, because our people were treated so badly by the United States government that in return for not only that episode in American history, but the various things that we gave up as a tribe. We've given up the majority of our indigenous land, our forests, our minerals, etc. And in return for that, we expect the federal government to meet its obligations to our people, whether it be health care or trust protection of our resources, etc. So I think the trust relationship can vary from tribe to tribe, but I think we all have to remember that Congress has set certain limits on what tribes have the authority to do and what we can't do. And we have to make an effort to live within those boundaries.
Ron?
Well, if I might add on that, part of your question was, do we, as we exercise our sovereignty, as we exercise, as President Inus said, our jurisdiction, and we have a greater capacity to administer that authority over jurisdiction over our lands and our peoples, do we have fears about repercussions? there's always politics that weigh into people's fears about the tribes as they become stronger political forces. And over the last 15 years or so, we have become stronger political forces. We've become very active in the political arena, and people are well aware of it. And there are those people out there who really don't like the fact that Indians have this very unique political status as sovereign nations within the framework of the United States government. And so those factions are always going to be out there. But what has also changed is our ability as sovereign nations to be able to fight back in the political process and protect our interests. In Washington, D.C., whether you're dealing with the administration, or whoever the administration is, or the new changing Congresses, we will always be able to protect our interests. You know, Chairwoman Divers, you know, commented about the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act as an example where some of our sovereignty was diminished. And so but it was actually proposed to be diminished even more. But we fought back, and we won a compromise in terms of protecting our sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So no, we're not fearful of those repercussions. Mm-hmm. They're going to be out there. They're always going to try to take away from the Indian people what unique status we have, and we'll protect our own.
And I think there's nothing better to fight back with than the sort of proof is in the pudding. That is, when the economies are getting stronger, when the schools are being better run, when the police department is doing its job, when, as Diane says, when the courts are doing their tribal courts are doing their job. It's hard for people to say you're not doing a good job, you know. And
you mentioned the situation in the state of New Mexico. I'm sure President Garcia would agree that Governor Richardson has been in the forefront of appointing American Indian people to various positions in state government. He elevated the assistant or the secretary for Indian Affairs to a cabinet level position in New Mexico, and putting in a plug for my wife as one of the only two female, soon to be two female American Indian members of the State Tourism Commission. So I think New Mexico has been on the forefront in involving its Indian population in politics and in the political system in the state. And I think it recognizes also the fact that the gaming tribes in New Mexico exercise a great deal of economic influence as well as political influence in New Mexico, simply because they do generate jobs, and they do contribute to the surrounding economies in our state.
I'd like to add that in the State of the Indian Nations address, one of the things that was pointed out is that the first point, the major point, is that if we make our tribal governments strong, build a capacity, learn all you can about this system, not just the political system, but the process in this country, the lawmaking process, the economics, and all of that, then we have strong governments. And if you have strong governments, then all of those other underlying things, like health care, like education, like economic development, fall into place. And so that's one of the things that we really, really need to continue to work on in Indian country, is to build those strong governments. And if you take, I think that the people that are data-driven, you'll find within the databases that those tribes and those Indian nations that have strong governments are also very economically powerful. And as well, they become political machines. And I think that's a fear that comes from the other side. And so if people are fearful, well, let them be fearful. But I think the right thing to do is what we're doing. So we need to continue to do that. So that message should be, I think it's heard all across the nation in Indian country, and we're doing that.
What's most important is more people are proud of what we are achieving, not negative.
That's
We
right.
have to keep doing what we're doing. It's do or die, but we just have to be more tactical about how we go about maintaining our right to exist as sovereign nations.
we've just changed Congresses. Many of the state houses have turned over. Increasingly, in a number of states, Indian citizens are in the state legislature, on county boards of commissioners and so forth. How do you see the political winds blowing now with respect to Indian policy? I know I'm asking the crystal ball question a little bit, but as you look 3-4 years down the road, how do you see Indian policy in terms of its support or opposition to the sovereignty you've been talking about, any of you?
Tribes look at an individual candidate or an individual legislator, an individual congressperson or president. They look to see what they're going to do, and they look to see how they view Indian policy and sovereignty For instance, some of the best Indian policy thinking came from Ronald Reagan, former President Nixon. Got them mixed up there. Nixon, and that's where the self-determination aspect came from. And he was a Republican. A lot of the legislation that has been favorable to Indian policy has been from Democrats as well. And we were talking about that this morning in terms of social programs. Tribes, because of our past history and in some cases, unfortunately, of poverty, have had to look to the federal government and Congress for those kinds of individuals that were willing to build those policies, build those programs, social programs, housing, health, and all of those things. And those typically have been Democrats. But we've given our support to folks like John McCain, who has been very strong for Indian policy decisions and Indian programs and Indian sovereignty. Was one of the key backers of the Indian Gaming Act in 1988 or thereabouts. So it varies. But, go ahead.
Are you done?
No, for now.
Oh, no disrespect. We should not leave anything to chance. For instance, if we talk about Congress, there's been a shift. Yes, there's been a shift. But it doesn't mean that our issues are going to get addressed just because there's a shift. And so we have to be cognizant of what are the target points that we need to concentrate on. And one of those things is I think the tribes are working on, NCAI is certainly working on that, and that is education for those people that serve the people of the United States, and that's congressional people. And I believe that there's three general areas that we need to pursue. One of them is that those that congressmen, congressional people that are friends will always be our friends pretty much. And they support us and they help us. And so we'll continue to work with them. But there are these others that sit along the fence line, and they could be persuaded one way or the other, depending on who gets to them first and who sends the message to them on where the needs are and what things we need to work on. And so I think that's important for us, the Indian people, to tell the story and give them the reality of what life is out there in Indian country and not hear it from anybody else, because we live that. Our community members live that. So we have firsthand information, and that certainly serves better than any database that could be out there. Tell the real story. We have to do that so we can get to those congressional people. But then there are the others that I call them outliers, as in they do in statistics, outliers. For whatever reason, we don't concentrate on those people that either don't have a lot of Indian constituency or they don't associate with Indian issues for whatever reasons they don't. But we need to get to them as well and also educate that group, because there's a lot more of them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's important to also have a strategy so that our congressional people also work with those and get those people informed and get them on our side and tell them, let them hear the real story. And so I think that it's just a little bit simple strategy, but gosh, if we can begin to do that, I think we're going to make a lot of headway, and we are doing that. And so I feel really good about that. But we can't just leave it to chance, because there's been a change, much as you do when you have state elections. We may have Indian people, but we can't just leave it to them. Now they're elected, go do your job. We still got to work the system, and we still got to be involved, and we still got to keep rolling and keep rolling. And the Indian vote is another one that we got to keep that rolling. And I know that it's worked. I mean, I think everyone here knows that it's worked, and so there are a lot of things that are really, really positive, and we just need to keep massaging, keep nurturing, and I think we'll accomplish a lot more.
You got to remember the politics, the changing politics. I mean, you referenced the changing of party leadership, whether it's in the Congress or in state legislators, governorships, et cetera. Like President Inus said, is that we had an effect on that. We looked at these candidates, not relative to are they Republican or Democrat, but relative to what is your position with regard to Indian affairs. Our relationship is about government to government. It's not Republican or Democrat. It's about government to government. Are you helping our relationship and addressing our issues or not? And so a lot of the changing of politics we had an influence on because we heard a better platform from a person that was on this party versus this party, and so we went for that individual. Had nothing to do with whether or not the Republican or Democrat. So and our issue really is play that politics. So now when you go to Washington, D.C., because our votes count, because they like our money now, our money is as green as everybody else's, so now they care about us. Now they want, I mean, we joke about it, but now they care about our votes, they care about our money, and so now they're going to start paying attention to Indian affairs and the legislation at all levels, from the federal government to the state government to the local government.
I was going to talk a little bit about state government. The tribes in Minnesota have been very aggressive about calling elected officials into communities where reservations are located. We can swing votes in local legislative elections, and have worked hard on behalf of candidates and have done a lot of grassroots organizing. There's been tensions in our state in many of the counties and local municipalities over misunderstanding about the trust relationships and treaty rights and things like that. So it has been very incumbent upon tribal communities to say, you know, let's talk about tourism, let's talk about treaty rights, let's get some information out there to communities. What is our employment base? We pump about $50 million into the local payroll. We're the largest employer in our county. What are we doing for rural economic development? When you start talking in those terms, it's easier to have some of those discussions about how do you help us build our infrastructure, like, you know, can we do some cost sharing on roads, things like that. But those are all discussions that really need to happen at a local level as well as at a national level. And I see us working just as hard with local political entities and statewide as I do seeing it at the federal level.
I think in New Mexico, Mark, if I understand you, swore in the governor. Is that correct?
President Garcia swore in Governor Richardson.
Yeah, I did, special occasion, and in fact, I had to ask permission of my tribal council because I'm obligated there first. And when Governor Richardson called and asked, I said, well, I'd like to, but sir, I have to work with my council. And council said, this is an opportunity, this is making history, and so they gave me their blessings, and I went off, and I
Good.
sort of.
In New Mexico, the native population there is relatively high compared to lots of states. As Joe said, in a number of states, there are no reservations at all, for example. Are the Pueblos and the tribes in New Mexico pulling together, do you think, with respect to the state of New Mexico's policies?
I think we are. I think the Pueblos and the other tribes in New Mexico share a lot of common interests. I was going to say about the kind of to follow up on what some of the other speakers said, I think education is so important because even though the administration or the makeup of Congress has changed, I don't think we need to let our guard down. A lot of the members of Congress, be they Republican, Democrat, Independent, still don't have an accurate idea of what it means to live in Indian country. They don't have an accurate idea of what it means to be Indian and to live within the confines of a reservation. So it behooves us to educate our members of Congress at every opportunity, because if we don't, they're never going to understand why we come back each year asking for money for this program or that program. I think too many people have a misconception about the various services that are provided to Indian people as being services that are there just by virtue of the fact that we're Indians, and where in fact it's because the federal government took something from the various tribes in exchange for obligating itself to do something in return for that. And it's a process of continuous education. Yeah. But I think to respond to your question, yes, I think the Pueblos and the various tribes in New Mexico have worked together to educate our state legislators. So there's more capital outlay that's come our way. There's more cooperation among the various Pueblos and tribes as far as projects that are going to benefit not them, but projects that also benefit the surrounding economies to the various reservations and pueblos. So yes, I think we've been able to work together very successfully in New Mexico.
I think that education seems awfully important. My experience as well has been there's just so little knowledge sometimes about even what functions a tribe is performing. Oh, you're running your own police force, you're running your own courts. These kinds of things are so often, even with the state legislator or someone in Congress often.
Or jurisdiction, whether it's enforcement, whether it's hunting and fishing activities. Now the legislators at both levels need to understand those issues. So what's happening, NCAI, for example, it holds orientation opportunities with congressmen. Tribes are collaborating with legislators to have an orientation day or orientation section so that we can educate new legislators or new congresspeople with regard to the tribe's sovereignty, the tribe's jurisdiction, the issues that tribes are facing and are trying to address, to help them become more knowledgeable, not only the leadership, but their staff as well.
Yeah. Well,
that orientation, we kind of joke about it, but the serious side is that we call it Indian 101.
yeah, yeah.
And I think that, I dreamt this one night about what else can we do? And my dream or my vision was that we give 101, Indian 101, to all the congressional people. But what we ought to do is we ought to require newly elected congressional people to pass a test on Indian 101. Not just take the course, but everybody. And, and if they don't pass that test, they don't, just like a bar exam, they don't be full-fledged congressional people.
You all have been providing at least Indian 201 here, so we appreciate that. And as the usual format here, we're going to now let some of the members of our audience ask you questions, particularly our students. And so we invite members of the audience. There's microphones in the two aisles here, and pose questions to our panel. And please say who you are and what organization or school or whatever you are from.
Good evening. My name is Pablo Quintanilla. I'm a second-year student at the Kennedy School. And first of all, I want to thank you for being here tonight. One of you mentioned how gaming nations or tribes exert their political influence or economic influence. And I'm wondering, in what ways do tribes that are doing well economically exert their influence or exert their sovereignty, which is tonight's topic, or one of the topics for tonight?
Anybody?
I'll start by saying that what that revenue does is it provides us revenues to enhance our governmental capacity. And so that's one thing, so you function more as a government. It also gives us resources in which that we can make donations. And I mentioned it earlier. Politicians like money, so the tribes can contribute to elections in that kind of a process. But most importantly is our stature as a government to be able to exercise that governmental authority, and the fact that we generate a lot of jobs and we generate a lot of revenue for the local economy. We enhance the tax base big time, and so we make a major difference to the local economy, the state economy. So those are just a couple of examples.
Dan?
How do we do that? We're not any different from any other entity that has interests. Our interest is life or death, however, because you have to remember that if we are not, if our sovereignty isn't affirmed, that means the end of reservations. So, for example, what we do, there are issues that come up. Not only do we lobby or donate campaign funds or do other political activities, but we do it not only for ourselves, but other tribes that are less fortunate. Not all the tribes that do gaming make a lot of money. There's varying degrees of success. For instance, right now there's some legislation, well actually it's IRS situation with the tax-exempt bonding or of government facilities. Tribes are treated differently. We're not accorded the same rights that cities and municipalities and other non-Indian governments have. They can do tax-exempt bonding for, like, say, for instance, a convention center. Tribes have been taken out of that category, so we cannot do that. We're treated less than, but we're willing to go ahead and try to lobby and do whatever is politically expedient, not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of all tribes, because it does affect everybody. And again, it goes to that federal trust relationship.
Let me take a question up here in the loge.
Hi, how are you? I'm Steve Cohen. I'm a first-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to the school, and Chairman-elect Diver, to welcome you back to the school. Nice to have a Kennedy School grad on the stage. I took Professor Cult's class over the January term nation building, and we talked a lot about the extent to which independent judiciaries affect a nation's success, and the correlation between independent judiciaries and economic development and some of the other success that different nations have had across the United States. All of you mentioned this evening about words like sovereignty and rule of law. And I'd be interested to hear if you could describe just briefly the types of independent judiciaries, if you have them, or the type of judicial functions that you have in your governments, and the extent to which federal and state authorities, both surrounding and at large, respect and or grant operational sovereignty to you in terms of judiciary.
You've
Salt
worked in the
River.
courts a little bit.
Salt River, issue of comedy. We have an agreement or an understanding, notwithstanding some Supreme Court decisions to the contrary, that the state of Arizona traditionally will work with us in affording comedy. What that means is that if there's a state action and they want to come into the community, for instance, to serve a warrant, I'm an attorney, by the way, criminal defense. If they want to do that, they can they petition our court for comedy. And our court will look at the request, the petition for comedy, and because it's another sovereign, generally will accept it and then allow them to carry out their law enforcement. And that is a nation-to-nation, government-to-government, example of their recognition of our sovereignty.
You also see it in Indian Child Welfare. The Indian Child Welfare Act is a good example where the states recognize the tribal court system in terms of those adoption cases and placement cases for children that go into the court. So that's one area that's really important. And the courts is a very sensitive issue for the tribes. Out of the 561 tribes, there's only about 185 or 86 courts that are out there. So some tribes don't use courts. So they have different kind of a judicial system, and pueblos are among them. But one of the areas of concern that we've always had is the federal government has never really, even though it's been a problem, has never been supportive of it. So it's an area that is seriously underfunded, and we've been championing and trying to get additional resources to elevate the capacity of our court system so that the due process can be administered more effectively.
But one of the things that's important is that if your tribal court is up to par, then the sovereignty part plays another big role here. And that means if you can sign memorandum of agreements or memorandum of understanding, either to share data or to have cross-deputization or whatever, I think that's using the sovereignty to advantageously to not only have the safety of your community at heart, but the rest of the community. For instance, DWI. Unless there are agreements between the state and the Indian nation about what they do with DWI sharing information, you could have someone that stopped on the Indian land base and gets a DWI and then never gets reported to the state. And so you have this continuous thing rolling. And in that sense, it could mean somebody's death there. And so I think it's important to understand that the level of the court's competence, if you will, is important. And so that helps the tribe then to share information and to work in partnership with the state or with the local other communities so that you have that understanding, and it builds a stronger force, if you will, so that you can battle and keep the people in the area safe. If you don't do that, then we're going to be scattered, and so that's to nobody's advantage.
If I may, Mescalero is sort of, I don't know if it's unique, but it's different in the sense that the Constitution doesn't require our judges to be attorneys or even to have any law school degree or law school formal education. And that's been both a help and a hindrance to our case, because traditionally and culturally that might be okay for parties in the tribe that have an issue in tribal court. But if you have an outside entity that wants to repossess a vehicle or wants to garnish someone's wages or wants child support, then it does become an issue, because the judges simply don't have that education. They don't have the necessary knowledge that it takes to administer that type of a case. And if it becomes too much of a problem, that can damage the tribe's reputation among not only its own people, but the surrounding communities, because they're looked on as a little bit backward in their judicial system and say, well, if you go live in Mescalero or wherever, we can't touch you because you can go over there and hide, which is an incorrect perception. But again, it perpetuates this misunderstanding of Indian peoples. And I think at Mescalero, the trend among our people has begun to where they're saying, you know, I think maybe we need to take a look at this, and maybe we need to change the Constitution and require that of our judges and up their salary and all the things that go along with it.
Minnesota's a public law 280 state, so Minnesota has criminal jurisdiction and we have civil regulatory jurisdiction. But we've been very aggressive in working with state conservation officers and local police jurisdictions to have memorandums of agreement and who responds when and all of those types of things, and very aggressive on Indian child welfare. We actually, our tribal government does hire our tribal attorney, and it's been a source of contention amongst the community of saying, you know, are the checks and balances there for the legislative and executive branch? And there's been some talk of electing it, but once again, you go to qualifications, and if you're going to uphold your sovereignty and make your case, then you have to have the structure there, and right now we do require an attorney. And so as part of building our long-term sovereignty, it's building that social capital and having those levels of expertise available there, because we want to be able to have our tribal court be respected in multiple jurisdictions. But it is an issue for our community to say, you know, we want separation of powers within our government, and how do we hold that accountable?
Take the gentleman up there. Yes, sir.
Good evening with everyone. My name is Carlos Chango. I am a first-year Master in International Development student. I am from Chibuleo, an indigenous community in Ecuador, and I am very happy that indigenous here in North America, specifically in the United States, are doing a great job. My question is, do you have, or your tribe or your pueblo have any relationship or cooperation with any Latin America native indigenous community or population?
We have a relationship with an organization in Phoenix called Tona Tierra, and what it does is it houses and it assists immigrants, and it's not a question of whether they're legal or illegal. It's just people from Latin America that need social services, educational help, and through our 12%, what we have as a result of our compact with the state of Arizona, we give funding to organizations like that, and they are one organization. But I will say that the United States says a lot about trying to do something about the illegal immigration problem. What we need to do is help those indigenous communities. The United States needs to help them out, because a lot of the people that come here illegally are indigenous people. I was in Mexico in early November and went up to a part near Dolores, Hidalgo, and the people that I met there speak Spanish. They are very Catholic, but to look at them, I mean, they're indigenous people, but they have no established land base. They have rancherias, old villages that were left over from pre-conquest days, but our government and their government need to work together to come to a solution so that these people can stay in their indigenous territories, and that goes for all of Latin America. The World Bank, I believe, was setting up a fund where the tribes or anybody that wanted to invest money to offer loans to small communities in Latin America would be able to do that. And I believe that that is still being developed, but I salute that kind of effort, because it has to be an economic aid.
National Congress of American Indians, President Garcia and I, as an officer, have also hosted, meetings with other indigenous nations from Latin America and South America, Australia, New Zealand, in terms of sharing, governmental practices. And so we've actually made visits, to different countries. They've invited us down, and so some of our delegation would go down and have visits. We've had delegations come up into our forums, the National Congress, to talk about how we interface as intergovernmental affairs in terms of sharing governmental practices, programs, and those kinds of things. and we have actually protocols between us and the First Nations up in Canada as well. So we do reach out to our brother and sister nations throughout the world.
Mescalero Apache tribe has a very cordial relationship between our tribe and the state of Chihuahua. I had the pleasure of going down there last September for an international festival in Chihuahua, and I learned a lot of about the past history of the Mescalero Apaches, or the Apache people in general, because they used to roam into northern Mexico and of course conducted a lot of raiding, and there was a lot of blood spilled on both sides, and that damaged, I think, down through the centuries, the relationship. And just over the last 5 or 6 years, the respective groups have reached out to one another and tried to heal that that hurt and that damage that was caused so long ago. And so we've developed a very, very good relationship between the government of Chihuahua, the government of Mexico in general, and particularly the state of Chihuahua. And it was great to go down there. We were treated very well. I had the opportunity to speak in the town square, and there was probably a couple thousand people there. And at the end of it, we had some social dancing from some of our groups that were there. And there must have been at least 1,000 people out there doing the back and forth and the round dance. So I can say that it's been a very pleasant relationship for us.
Yes, thank you. Hello, my name is Ayenga Bokamba, and I'm a graduate student here at the College of Education here at Harvard. And I'm very concerned about education in native land, and you've spoken very eloquently about the need to educate members of Congress, but I'm wondering if you would share your thoughts about your vision of the connection between political sovereignty and educational sovereignty in native land, particularly around the idea of leadership development for young people as they're trying to figure out how to take over and honor the traditions that from each of your peoples. I'd be honored if you would address that in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. The No Child Left Behind Act, as you all know, has had a lot of controversy. But I think the good intent of the No Child Left Behind, there's a missing part that should have been included, and that has to do with Indian language, culture, and tradition. No mention about that. But that's where I think, Mr. President, that the Indian Education Act, we passed one in New Mexico, 2004, and the Indian Education Act in New Mexico is sort of the, you might call it the interface between the No Child Left Behind and the education needs in at least New Mexico that will include language, culture, and not only that, but even certification of teachers. And so I think it's important that if you understand who you are, you understand where you came from, if you understand and speak your language, then you're really a whole person, if you will. If you lose that language, if you lose the tradition and the culture, then you're going to be a lost soul. And that's the way we believe that. How do we incorporate this into the education system? And if you really, really think about where the education system in this country came from and how it originated, how it even got to be a system, there was no inclusion, not of native culture, not of languages, and not of anything. And the standards that are developed, standards that are used for testing and whatnot, include nothing like that. And so, who's going to change that? The Indian people have to be the ones in the forefront to change that, because how does anyone else know what to conclude if they've never lived it? And so it's an important piece that we have to really be involved in. I think the leadership is the same way. I just got done with 1 whole week's activity of traditional stuff, and I couldn't be here last night because our last session was yesterday. And so I came in this morning, but I think had I just left, one part of my life, for this year at least, would have been missing because I didn't fulfill my part. And so it's up to us then to also train our young ones, to train our grandchildren, to train our children, to be serious about knowing who you are, where you came from, your language and your culture. And the Native Language Act that was just passed, I think it's H.R. 4766. That is a major, major law that will preserve native language. And right now I think the number's like a little over 50 languages that are left over. There used to be more than 1,000 languages, native languages in this country. And so it's scary. But I think how do we develop and how do we use that? It's a major part of developing leadership. So all of those blended in, along with the academic side of the dominant society in this country, blend those in, blend the culture, blend the language, bring in the ways of the elders, the ways of your people. Then you become a whole person. And so more power to us if we continue that. But if we lose that piece, it's going to be a sad day. And I don't think it's going to happen because the Spirit is alive and the Spirit's moving, and we're going to make sure that we do our part so that we do have young leaders. And it's good to see that there are a lot of young students here that are moving forward. And a few years ago, it wasn't that way. We could count all of the participants on our hand. Not that way now, and it's a good feeling. It's a good feeling. So keep up the good work, students, and no matter how old or young you are.
Karen?
I'd like to make a couple comments because there's competing dichotomy in Indian education. We run our own schools. We make sure that we have the culture and the commitment to community and all of those things that nurture the soul. But Indian education funding hasn't been, the per child ration hasn't been increased in about 12 years. So we're fighting infrastructure needs. For a lot of our families that might send kids to town school, so to speak, they have maybe adequate funding for the 3 Rs, but we're not getting them out of school at the rate we would like. So we're seeing a cumulative 80% dropout rate out of schools in our surrounding area. They'll give you your senior year and say we're graduating 60% of Indian students, but if you take from 9th grade to 12th, it's 80% dropout rate. Well, if we have a 1% higher education rate in Indian America, it begs to say that we need to get them out of K-12 first. And so that is part of my worry is that parents seem to be having to choose. Where does it feel good to them? Where does education feel safe? Where does it feel nurtured? Where does it affirm who they are? Versus the parents who want to send them to town schools because they want them to have the diversity of the surrounding communities, et cetera, but they risk losing identity. So we need to figure out, I think, especially where the communities are smaller, more integrated with surrounding communities, it's an ongoing issue for us to build our educational infrastructure, but also to hold other educational institutions accountable for graduating Native students and helping us build that social capital.
And the parents, want to hold the parents accountable.
As well.
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased and honored to be amongst you, both panelists in attendance. I come from South America, from Bolivia, and I'm ambassador from Bolivia for the Organization of American States. And I have this opportunity to be here, and I'm also part of the commission for the Declaration of the Indigenous Rights as Vice President. So I'm very happy to be amongst you. And I bring also the salute from our country to all of you, both the declared indigenous and the non-declared indigenous, because actually everybody are brothers and sisters. And I think also Indo-European origins of everybody link us to earth and to the divine equally. So in terms of this declaration, we're actually looking for points of encounter with brothers and sisters, and we would like to have closer relationships in order to accelerate this process in this declaration Next meeting is going to take part in Bolivia by March, end of March this year. So we would be happy if we could sign that declaration there. You're all invited to come. And we actually would like to have like a team to make build some bridges amongst people so we could resolve some of the difficulties that we encountered towards this declaration being signed. And a little question after this would be if there is a possibility to have a permanent connection with representatives of yours in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Does NCAI have a formal role in the International Declaration?
Well, I just had discussion with a gentleman from Canada, I believe, Tony Belcourt. He's part of that movement, if you will, and we talked about, I think it was this Bolivia, it's happening in March, I believe, right? Yes. And he's made an invitation to NCAI, and we've been in continuous dialogue over this, but I'm hoping to have a delegation, if not just myself, but maybe some of the officers of NCAI come down to this signing of the declaration, or at least promoting that we also support it. But I think it's important that we continue to build the harmony and build the force, if you will, of our people, the indigenous people. And it's for human rights. So I mean that a lot of times we get opposition from our own governments, the United States, and I think Canada may be hindering us a little bit too, but I think we need to get beyond that, and so we'll do what we can to lend our support.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen.
My name is Athar Tahir. I'm here on the Executive Leadership Program from Pakistan. I was particularly intrigued by the concept of sovereignty and working within the US Constitution. Since I'm not very familiar with it, I'd like to share what we are doing in Pakistan. We have reserved seats for the minorities, which means that candidates from the minorities can campaign for the seats, and these seats are in the National Assembly. In order to bring the females into the mainstream, special seats were also reserved for them. So I was wondering if in the American Constitution and vis-a-vis your concept of sovereignty, would it be possible to introduce reserved seats for the American Indian tribes? And that perhaps would be a boost for them to come into the mainstream, which apparently one feels after hearing you all that is not the case.
So I guess the question would be, within the model in Pakistan, actual seats in Congress, if you will. I know the Cherokee have a treaty that provide for that, actually, but do you see any future in that, or do you have other agendas that you're working on to strengthen your claims and assertions of sovereignty?
Well, I think if you simply look at the process that we have in the country right now, it's a thing that has to do with the vote, native vote. And the more we get involved, then we don't have to really change the system in its entirety. It's using the same system that has worked for this country. And the trick then is to get Indian people to these positions. And that's happening in states right now. And so I think it's an important piece that we don't really have to change the organizational structure because, well, you know how change goes.
Yeah.
If it weren't for all the people, change would be easy. But I think it's important that if we can use the system that exists and elevate some of our people to get into these positions, not only at the county, local levels, but the states, and then from there over to the congressional, then you're working within the system, and I think that's a big plus. So that would be one thing that we should be promoting. We are promoting that, and we are seeing positive results.
Well, I would add to President Garcia's point that that system in Pakistan, in terms of trying to apply it in the United States, via our Constitution, would probably be very politically problematic because it's based on the sovereignty of the states. And the Constitution, as President Inus said, recognizes the sovereignty of the tribe. So it recognizes our sovereignty. But in terms of the representation, the way it's structured, it provides for a certain level, a certain number of House representatives, and it's based on the population. So that's why those numbers move around based on the population moving around. So there's a minimum. So there are states with only one representative. And so the problem is if you convert that over to the tribes, recognizing the sovereignty of the tribe, it would mean that they would have to recognize all 561 sovereign tribes, meaning 561 more
seats.
And they would have a huge problem with that because we now outnumber them. we would literally have them surrounded. So that politics would be very challenging. And then in the reverse, if you take it to a different kind of a context, let's say they agree to identify a couple of seats for the sovereign nations. The problem with the tribes would be how we would come together and agree on a system where we would select among the 561 existing tribes today. Yeah, one seat.
The biggest
seat
tribe.
We would debate among ourselves who much less the other 500. But anyhow, that's one of the problems with that proposal.
I just said the Navajos will want a seat because
Oh,
they're
yeah,
the
the
largest
Navajos.
tribes.
Well, certainly the case is strong, actually, that at least in two recent Senate races, Montana and South Dakota, that, as you were suggesting, the Indian vote was decisive in those two elections. And with the Congress so tightly divided, it matters. So getting that vote out obviously is critical. Brent.
Sego, Skenagoa, Gatsanuni, Scotnine, Aguego, Brent Miracle, Young Yachts, Mohawk Citizen, and Turtle Clan. We talked about transparency, and we talked about the difficulties of rule of law. But I think that I'd like to take a look at the economic development aspect of that and help. I realize it, but I think that it'd be good for everybody else to understand it, that there are actually corporations that are doing business with American Indians and their governments, and I'd like to hear about what has been done to take care of some of the challenges, like tribal courts, IBM, Home Depot, Bank of America. These are just a couple of examples that are doing business on Indian territory. And I think it'd be important to help everyone understand what you've done to overcome some of the challenges, because court system is a big challenge, but also ordinances, and kind of demystify this notion that you go on to Indian country and you get everything tax-free.
Right now, the Fond du Lac Band has a $120 million development project going on around gaming, but also in really expanding tourism base, working with local jurisdiction, hooking up to a trail network. Northern Minnesota is beautiful. We're taking advantage of the location. People who do business with us have to submit to a court of competent jurisdiction. That's tribal court. That takes some, or another court that they agree upon. So it's an education effort. But it goes a long way to say that that's a lot of money being pumped into the local economy. Right now, we're the biggest project in all of northern Minnesota going on right now. Construction workers are flocking to us. So we are a major player economically, and people are willing to have a little bit harder conversations about what is tribal sovereignty, what does it mean, what does our rule of law mean, and how does it relate to you. Those conversations would not be possible if we weren't the driver of a $120 million project. So it's an educational effort for everybody in the surrounding community. People are so happy about the employment, good living wage jobs, construction jobs, looking forward to long-term continuing employment. But it also helps us communicate some of our community values. For example, we take a strong stand in my nation about drug and alcohol use. Any vendor who comes onto the reservation has to have a drug and alcohol use and testing policy that is at least as stringent as our own. because we want our community values to be go through all of our vendors as well. And if it's good enough for us, it's good enough for those of us who we give our money to. So certainly being an economic player in the region does give tribal nations an opportunity to provide not only education, share our resources by providing employment, buying goods and services locally, and also have people understand what does a good and strong tribal sovereignty look like, and how can we partner together to make it a win-win for all of us.
What the Salt River Indian community has had to do in terms of its economic development issues is we had to develop a whole set of ordinances relevant in particular to Salt River. We've developed a permitting process, an approval process for long-term lease. If you wanted to develop a lease, for instance, on Salt River, you could get a 99-year lease. And how we do that is we have our own internal process of review by Land Management Board. It eventually comes to council. It has public hearings. And it's very, very clearly defined in our internal processes as far as the ordinances. And we've had to do that to assure anybody that wants to do long-term leasing in the community of fairness. We also have the ability to do federal arbitration in the event of dispute resolution, where we have very, very limited waivers of sovereign immunity, which again is an act of a sovereign in terms of having to deal with financial arrangements, bank structures, loan structures, complex financial things of that sort. Again, we've had to hire very high finance legal firms to assist us in that. And again, it's federal arbitration. And a lot of that goes to dispute resolution, what tribes have to do and what they're willing to do to ensure fairness to the other party.
One of the points in terms of getting corporations and financial institutions to do business with us, these points are all correct, and they apply in different aspects throughout all our reservations. But what we're finding is the court of jurisdiction is a sensitive issue, and the due process is the one that has the biggest hang-up in terms of getting corporations to bring some plant onto our reservation, or for a banking institution or bonding institution to issue a large bond, is where their redress is if things go awry. And so what many tribes have done is they've learned how to issue limited waivers of sovereignty, so it goes into a court of jurisdiction or an arbitration process that's acceptable to both parties. And so it's getting very sophisticated in the business sector, but we're doing it in a very surgical way, so that we're not jeopardizing the resources or assets of the tribal government or our peoples.
The most obvious place about that kind of activity, though, has to do with gaming, because it's within the compact languages in most cases. But I think it's important to understand that if we're talking about economic development, it's not just gaming. Gaming is just one piece of it, and I think if we diversify, that's really where it's at. And the things to diversify in Indian country now is energy development, new energy, clean energy development, I think. And so we have to do our part to help, especially those tribes that don't have that economic base as of yet. And so we need to do our part to help them along, to lend them our services, or to gain support and give them some kind of chance so that they can work. And I think it's important to understand that since not all tribes, or especially those that are in remote areas, they can't, gaming wouldn't help if you were trying to open up a gaming facility, say maybe in South Dakota or North Dakota or elsewhere. That wouldn't work. So we got to find other means by which that economic development can happen, and sometimes the resource needs really outweigh what can be done by any tribe. And I think even in a lot of languages, the grants and other things that come as a result of our lobbying, congressional legislation, for instance, economic development, I think there's a misunderstanding, a perception out there that when you're going to do economic development, that the infrastructure is already in place. Big assumption. And so if you don't even have the water, if you don't have the sewer lines, if you don't have the telephone system, you don't have electrical power, then you could have a big grant, but you're not gonna do a whole lot because you got to redevelop them and you got to develop all of that infrastructure. And then the biggest, I guess, error, if you will, perception-wise, is that we think that the human resources are always there, especially if you go technically. If you say you wanted to establish a telecommunications development, and you're going to assume that the infrastructure may be there, the physical plant may be there, but what about the people? And so if you don't train your own, if you don't grow your own in that way, it's another element that sometimes we tend to forget, and I think it's important for us to realize that when we talk about infrastructure, we're also talking about the human resource part, and it's a really important part, and this is what y'all were talking about, education. We got to bring them along, so it's a big picture issue, so thank you for the question.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to draw the formal part of this to a close. I see we still have a lot of questions, and I hope that we'll have a little informal conversation. But first, I want to thank you for being here. It's an honor to have heads of state here. It's also an honor for the example that you set for leaders for any nation. So thank you very much for all of you being here.